welcome everyone. Welcome to panel 4, Boards and ESG, tone at the top. My name is Dan Konigsburg. I'm Deloitte's global leader for corporate governance and our boardroom program global lead. It's a real honor for me to be here with all of you today and among so many distinguished guests and panelists. I want to give a sincere thank you to Ashraf and everyone at Hawkamah who's worked so hard to organize today's events. I guess let me start by just saying that ESG is a topic for boards that isn't very new. It's been around for a long time. Questions around climate, sustainability, boardroom diversity, these have been around for a while, and I think a lot of good boards have grabbed a hold of them and I think made them part of the boardroom agenda for a while. But I think it's only been in the last year and a half with the advent of the pandemic, with a lot of employee and stakeholder concerns about ESG, and particularly a lot of institutional investors raising concerns, that this has really become a very sharpened discussion. I think for many companies, the pandemic has brought a realization that these issues are bigger than ever, not going away, and that there are more questions than ever. How do we get ahead of these things? How do we anticipate concerns? How do we disclose? And how do we really make a difference with respect to diversity in the boardroom? These are not easy questions. And so to help us think through them, we are very fortunate to be joined today by 4 incredibly knowledgeable and talented panelists. I'll introduce them very briefly. I suspect you've got background information in your materials as well. But based in Dubai, we've got Qais, Gharaibeh, a business representative for the Middle East for Diligent. Everyone knows Diligent, the governance and GRC software company. He's also a founder and board member at Spine Technologies. I expect Qais will be able to speak about these issues through the eyes of its many clients at Diligent, but also as a board member himself. Welcome, Qais. Next, we have Linda Hoon, who joins us today from Singapore, where she is Chief Legal Officer and Group Company Secretary at Singapore Post Limited. Sing Post is a global leader in e-commerce and logistics. It operates across 19 geographies, and Linda works directly with the board of Sing Post, and I'm sure has a really great perspective as a result. Welcome, Linda.
Thank you.
Next, joining us from Paris today is Sophie Lelias, co-founder of the International Corporate Governance Network, where, full disclosure, I serve on the board of governors. She is president of LeaderXXchange, which advises and promotes diversity and sustainability in governance. Sophie serves on the boards of 5 companies, including French luxury goods maker Kering, think Gucci, and Saint Laurent, where she is lead independent director. Sophie also serves on the boards of Herbalife in the US, Agence Française Locale, an unlisted French bank, and 2 investment funds, the Africa 50 Infrastructure Fund based in Morocco, and the Positive Impact Fund, which invests in companies aligned with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Sophie's also not feeling super well today, so we're going to keep it light for Sophie, but we really appreciate you joining us when you're not super well. Sophie, thank you. And last but certainly not least, joining us, I believe from Geneva, am I right? Yes, we have Anthony Miller, who's the Economics Affairs Officer at UNCTAD, the UN's trade and development arm, where he leads the United Nations Sustainable Stock Exchange Initiative, which I think many of us have heard of and is doing fantastic work promoting better standards of corporate governance and sustainability from a market lens. Welcome, Anthony. Appreciate you being here too. So let's get right into it. Let's start, if you don't mind, with climate as a way into ESG. There's a lot of pieces of ESG, but why not start with climate and the challenge that it presents to boards today? And maybe, Linda, we could start with you in Singapore, because you do work so closely with the Sing Post board. You know, as you think about your work with the board, do you think about climate with respect to board composition when you're bringing on new board members? Are you looking to find climate experts or what sometimes is called, you know, climate competent board members? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So first up, very much immense thanks to Hawkamah Institute of Corporate Governance for inviting me. And I think I will start by actually turning it in another way. What exactly is the business case for a board to be concerned with ESG sustainability and thereby bringing about the need to upgrade, to upskill the competencies across the board composition? So I would say, having been very fortunate in SingPost to be together with the board chairman, who incidentally decided that he would first chair the board sustainability committee of my company, was that in Singapore, 2018 onwards, all listed companies on the Singapore Exchange have to deliver a sustainability report. But therein lies, many of these companies are in the nascent stages of putting together a meaningful and purposeful report. So in our journey, and I could just relay very quickly that first, one of the things that the board will have to do is to look at the competencies across its own composition, and which I've mentioned, a large part of it would rely very heavily on what we call a very thorough and rigorous review of the board composition matrix, or some companies call it the board skills matrix. So in that sense, the board then decides, usually it's through the nominating committee, and the nominating committee gives a very, very hard look on the various competencies. And I would say that in this area, I think, in terms of looking at what is a good or a champion for ESG sustainability, there really is no person that can say, I am now qualified or certified professionally to be an ESG champion, particularly because board diversity comes through many different angles. So currently, I would just pause here to say that, so by first looking into the board composition matrix, by identifying the areas where the sustainability reporting will have to be skewed towards and what the board actually needs to see and needs to understand, then that would be a good start. So let me pause here then.
Well, thank you, Linda. That's great. So a couple of things you raised. I'm interested in the role of the chair. You raised that because I think you said he introduced it, or he became one of the leaders of the sustainability committee. But you also raised the business case. And maybe, Anthony, I can turn to you. I mean, as part of the Sustainable Stock Exchange Initiative, for those who don't know it, I mean, I suppose we'd love just a little bit of background, a few seconds on that. But also, I assume you don't have to make the business case to companies that you work with here, or do you? Do you have to make that argument and say, look, you need to focus on this, or you need particular competencies on your board?
Thanks, Dan. I think it's this business case. Of course, it's important for companies to understand that. I think now these days, many companies already do understand that. Certainly, the largest company in the world have internalized a lot of these things, and we've moved from the question of why to the question of how. And this is a question for companies: how do you integrate ESG management into the different operations of the organization? And that, of course, brings us to the question for this panel: is how do you integrate it into board operations? And I think that's a key thing, because it needs to be integrated into all factors of the company. 15, 20 years ago, you could have a company that had somewhere bolted on the side of it some little department called the sustainability department, and they did whatever they did. Nowadays, that's really not feasible anymore. If you're going to mainstream sustainability throughout the company, it has to be integrated into the functions of senior management, functions of the board, functions of every division in the company. So those are really, I think, some of the key things, and it's great to be here today that Hawkamah organized this. I'll close just by making an observation. Linda mentioned the Singapore Stock Exchange in Singapore. Yes, they've introduced mandatory sustainability reporting. They're not alone. So they joined about 25 markets around the world. Today, we're up to 26 markets in the world that have mandatory sustainability reporting. 10 years ago, that number would have been at or near zero. So this is that clear trend in the world. We fully expect by the year 2030, most major markets in the world will have mandatory sustainability reporting. So this is the clear trend in the world. And then this, of course, has knock-on effects. It's not just about reporting. What are you reporting on? You're reporting on the strategy of the company. You're reporting on targets. There are a lot of key things. And Dan, you touched on climate. This is going to be the challenge of the next 25 years for everybody to transition to net zero. That is an imperative for this planet. And that is fundamentally a board issue because it entails a lot of risk and a lot of fundamental questions about strategy.
Thank you, Anthony. You raised a number of really interesting questions there. And maybe, Qais, I can turn to you based on what you see, at your own company at Diligent, but also you have this bird's eye view through what you do as Diligent into all of these client companies, I suspect. Anthony makes this point that, sustainability, ESG cannot be simply bolted on to a part of the business. It can't be an add-on. It can't be sitting off in a little corner somewhere or something that the board only looks at once a year. Do you find that to be the case? I'm sure all your clients are different, but do you have to make that argument perhaps to some clients? Is it a difficult argument to make in 2021?
Thank you. So I'll start by a personal experience. Working for multinational organizations over the past 2 decades, the topic of sustainability started to come up over the past period, and not a lot of people in the organization would know about it and would know the relevance of that topic to their function or their role until what you see in Diligent, there is a very strong emphasis on creating awareness across the board within the organization. And it starts all the way from the board, all the way to all the functions across different geographies. And there's a high frequency of activities that relate to the sustainability initiatives that Diligent is embarking on, or the ESG program that Diligent is embarking on. And it all, I say one of the things that is distinguishing Diligent in this domain is that there's a clearly defined program communicated directly by the CEO of the company across the entire organization. And it covers many different topics or elements that are essential for, I would say, a well-rounded program. So we cover our carbon footprint and what we need to do in order to keep track of that, and we have a goal for a zero emission by 2040 or being carbon neutral by that time. We have deployed some audits on our different offices in different locations to see how we comply to the LEED standard, and we have clear target to achieve platinum status across all our different offices. And we're contributing in a number of different areas, whether it is capital that we deploy with other organizations to help them in their sustainability initiatives, or to leverage the insights that we have through our extensive ESG research that we do in order to support these organizations with education and awareness, which, as you might have heard from different panelists, whether in this panel or earlier, is becoming extremely essential even on the board level. When you look at our experience with different customers that we speak to, we see that the level of focus on ESG is kind of varying, and it has a number of different dynamics that really comes to it. There are, I think, there are certain industries that are at the core emphasis of the impact on climate, and therefore you will see more attention to it. So, for example, oil and gas, or organizations that have a strong use of plastic in their supply chain. So we see those becoming more aware, and even the board is more aware on this, and they of course work with us in order to help them with tools that can enable them to run their programs efficiently. And then you see other organizations, some are family businesses, some are publicly listed companies as well. They still are on their infancy stage of the journey to sustainability. So you would find similar examples such as what Anthony had referred to, where there is a sustainability program somewhere, it's publicized on the website, not a lot of people know about it. If you want to speak to them about sustainability, you might struggle sometimes to find the right people that will, that the topic will capture their interest. So just a couple of comments on those.
No, that's great. I mean, Qais, I think the audience, if you're willing to go here, I mean, I think the audience would be fascinated by the journey that Diligent has gone on, because you mentioned, I think you said that you have this target to be carbon net zero or carbon neutral by, was it 2040? Did you say
24?
Yeah. So, I mean, we don't need the whole story, but I think we're interested in, how did you reach that decision? Was the board involved? Did management come up with it, and did the board sort of engage on it and say, yes, we need to have this kind of target? Because it doesn't strike me, as you said, this is industry by industry, and yours, is not oil and gas, clearly not one of the ones we might imagine is the very, at the very sharp end of this. Can you talk a little bit about how you landed on that target?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there were two aspects to it. So the management of the company is strongly focused on ESG initiatives. We'll talk about equality as well, and other topics around diversity and so forth. So we're strongly focused on those topics, and also our investors are strongly focused on this. So the dialogue is very productive in those different dimensions, and it was clear for the management of the company throughout these dialogues that we need to take a leadership position in what we are doing to set the standards, to help set the standards, and to become a role model for similar peer companies in our domain. The other aspect to it is that we decided to commercially pursue the development of opportunities on the back of the ESG initiatives globally, and therefore we went through a spree of acquiring different companies that offer programs or that offer tools to support companies for programs on ESG, and with the combination of the two, and of course with the strong leadership at the top. Certain committees were assigned. They drilled down into what does ESG mean for us and what can we do in order to contribute to it. We designed a very comprehensive program, like I said. That program resulted in the requirement for us to gather data both internally and externally. And once we have gathered all of this data, we needed to use our own tools in order to come up with insights on how we are measuring against the KPIs that we set for ourselves. And then it enabled us to report to all the different stakeholders in a very transparent way how we are progressing against those. And then eventually also we identified the areas that we are weak in. And this is where you set up task forces in order to work on those and then be able to change the progress on the KPIs and have them reported transparently again.
That does sound like a fascinating journey and one that clearly evolved over time. I wonder if I could bring in Sophie at this point. Sophie, I mean, does some of that resonate with you when you think about, for example, your work at Kering? I mean, my understanding is you serve on the sustainability board committee at Kering. Is it doing similar things? Is it mainly focused on ESG risks to the business? Or is it something else there?
So first of all, thank you everyone for inviting me. And I want to thank particularly Dr. Ashraf, Alec, and Sadia for their incredible work. So I don't want to speak specifically to a company. I think that's something just to step back on that. But to the extent that I can mention Kering, I most certainly will. What Qais just suggested and what he described is something that I think is really the right journey. And it's really a journey where you're starting with identifying what are the major risks, then you're identifying some of your KPIs, you're engaging with your stakeholders to identify those risks to make sure you don't have a gap. But that's only one part of the coin. The other part is opportunity, because where there is risk and there's constraint, there's always opportunity for innovation. And I think that's where Kering is particularly strong. So on the sustainability, sustainability is not limited to sustainability, it's actually cross-functional. So the sustainability committee does a deep dive, but the governance committee will look at sustainability in terms of what Linda alluded to in terms of competencies. The compensation committee will look at sustainability to the extent that the KPIs are integrated into sustainability metrics and to remuneration, both of management as well as the senior top-level executives. And it's going to look at audit as well to the extent we're looking at risk management. So the way I see sustainability is really the sense of innovation, because I think you will not have the change that we need to have without disruption, and you don't have disruption without innovation. So I think that was the first, and I just wanted to pick upon maybe some of the 2 points that after Qais, but Anthony and Linda alluded to. I thought Linda also really, the experience I've seen, I think is really gave a very operational way on how to identify the skill sets. And I think this comparison in terms of what it is that you want to align with in terms of the report. So just want to make sure you have the right people to oversee the information that you have to report on, but also look at the alignment with the strategy. To the extent that ESG or sustainability or some of the drivers of sustainability are critical to your business strategy, you want to make sure that your board understands it. And I think Linda's point of upskilling is the right term, because this is an ongoing journey. It's not just about finding that one person who can fully understand what the issues are of today, but it's also creating a collective group that really understands that this is a major issue, both in terms of strategy and, as Anthony pointed out as well, to capital allocation. And so you really need to make sure that that upskilling is there. If you need a special expertise, you can bring it on, but you want to make sure that the entire board understands and doesn't leave it to one single director. They understand the questions they need to ask, but more importantly, they need to understand the answers to those questions, because it's the answers that really matter. It's not just asking those questions. So I just wanted to just pick up on those other points.
Thank you, Sophie. And Anthony, I see you nodding vigorously to Sophie's comment about don't leave it to one person. I often see this with my own work with boards, that sometimes there could be an advantage to bringing a kind of expert onto a board, but then at other times, there's real disadvantages there. It allows directors to remain, other directors to be silent or sort of defer to the expert. Is that something that you see, particularly when you get to these more strategic questions, the capital allocation questions, the opportunity of ESG that Sophie raises? Does that? Yeah.
I can just reiterate Sophie's point. I think when Sophie was making that point about you have to be able to understand the answer to the question, it reminded me of my days as sort of a college kid backpacking around Europe, and I could understand enough of European languages to ask questions, but I didn't know enough to understand the answer to the question. And very quickly you realize, what's the point of asking a question if you can't understand the answer? And so I fully agree with what Sophie said and what some of the other speakers have said. It's about having this competency on sustainability issues, and it cannot be just one person on the board who has that. It really has to be mainstream throughout the board. And the board needs to make sure that it's mainstream throughout the senior management of the company. Really, I mean, they're there to sort of ask these pertinent questions of the management and make sure the management is able to answer them in an intelligent way.
So just a reminder to our audience, because I think we've got a lot of people who are following the discussion, just a reminder to please do ask a question using the platform that you've got. I think there is a Q&A function on the platform. So do please think about questions for the panel, and I'll ask them. In fact, one has just come through for you, Qais, and I think it's specifically asking about whether you see more public companies in the UAE in particular, implementing ESG, spending more time thinking about it. So because I think you mentioned earlier that, it does depend, and you see it, more or less often depending on industry. And I'm sure that there can be regional differences too. Can you talk a little bit about what you see in the UAE in particular?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a couple of examples that I would bring. So the short answer is, of course, the demand is growing, the education on the topic is becoming broader, and there are more people that are finding it relevant to their internal discussions. Just yesterday, I saw on LinkedIn an announcement from the Crescent Group, which is primarily focused on oil and gas, where they have publicized their achievements on their KPIs that they have set for their carbon neutrality or carbon neutral objectives. So that was a big thing, and they were the first company in the region to broadcast such, in oil and gas, to broadcast such achievements to milestones. On another topic, I was speaking to the CEO of one of the big Middle Eastern companies who is publicly listed, and he has just joined the company, and he had to present in the AGM to the investors. And after commending him on the great insights that the investors have seen on the turnaround for the company from a financial perspective and business model perspective, they all had a unanimous request, which is we need to see a specific section that's dedicated to ESG, and we need to understand what are you doing and what are your goals in this domain, and what are you doing in order to achieve them. So that is just two examples that I could bring to light. But definitely, if you look at the broader spectrum, we're seeing that our conversations with customers on ESG are becoming more and more relevant. And this is across the board. Family businesses are looking into it. Publicly listed companies are looking into it. And we're seeing also, this varies also from industry to industry, as I referred to earlier. But definitely, there is much stronger awareness in the market about it, and there's a stronger drive to do something different than what previously has been witnessed.
So you raised there, Qais, just the question of disclosure, which is a big topic in this area, and maybe I could bring Anthony quickly back in on this, because I mean you do so much work at the Stock Exchange Initiative around promoting better disclosure, and I guess it's just a broad question about what we're all dealing with globally on this question. There is such a large variety of approaches and standards. There's competing standards. I know that I work with a lot of companies that are just frustrated, I think, by the lack of a common way to report and disclose. Do you have institutionally, do you have a view on this, that we need a more consistent approach, and what should companies do if we don't have it?
Sure, Dan, there's a lot of confusion in this space, and we often hear about people saying, I'm confused, there's too many standards. The reality is that there aren't that many standards. There's only really two standards in the world, and that's GRI and SASB. There's many other frameworks, tools, other sorts of things, but if it comes to reporting standards, there's basically two in the world. So it's not an overload of standards. That's getting, and the space on standards is getting further consolidated. The IFRS Foundation has announced well, they haven't formally announced the creation of it, but it's, I think, an open secret that they're going to announce this sometime during COP26 in about a month's time. The creation of the International Sustainability Standards Board, the ISSB. That will be leading out the gate with a reporting standard on climate disclosure, which is going to be based on the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, TCFD, which, by the way, the Singapore Exchange was the only stock exchange was a member of that. So they did a great job in that. And they also led Singapore to be in sort of a leading position. So I'm sure Linda can comment on that. But so there's more and more clarity in this space. And I think certainly the IFRS Foundation bringing its credibility from financial reporting to the space will certainly help. We've also seen a lot of leadership at the regional level in Europe, where they've come forth with their own reporting mechanisms. And it's not just corporate reporting, but now you're getting into taxonomies on products. And that's going to have also an effect, a ripple effect into corporate reporting as well, because all of these products now have to substantiate themselves based on the reporting of their constituents and so on. So I think the good news is there are less standards out there than people might think. There's a lot more consolidation, there's a lot more focus, but people really have to educate themselves and bring themselves up to speed on this.
So Anthony, you're painting a rosier picture than I expected about the consolidation of some of the reporting. Linda, you're smiling. Singapore was mentioned in again rosy terms. Do you agree with that? Do you, as an issuer, as a corporate, do you feel it is starting to come together? The outlines of this reporting landscape are becoming more clear, and is it less? Does it feel less confusing to you as a company?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think, Anthony, thanks for the segue. Well, certainly in Singapore, the public consultation from the Singapore Exchange regulatory has decided that it would look towards for climate disclosure, climate-related disclosures, to look to the TCFD recommendations. By and large, a lot of the Singapore companies listed on our Singapore boards have been using the GRI reporting standards. But there has been a call out repeatedly by many of the big institutions, one of which we all know is BlackRock. And BlackRock has been very relentless on its call out for a combined reporting under TCFD and SASB. So insofar as many of the Singapore companies are, quite honestly, BlackRock is everywhere in Asia, including Singapore. So for instance, in my company, they are the top 5 shareholder across a multitude of like 20 over funds. And when we have the engagement with BlackRock, I think it comes out very clearly. We are looking towards TCFD, SASB. So how we would relate to that would be that when we look towards the enhanced disclosures that the exchange is expecting Singapore companies to do, one of the things that we would be looking at would be how, in terms of the prioritization, so whether we like it or not, certain industries are prioritized and some are not. In the case of postal e-commerce, we're not quite prioritized. In other words, in the prioritized sectors, but it is very important and in fact, almost mandatory for a sector company like ours to still embark on TCFD anyway. Another thing I'd like to share with your audience that the fact that there is TCFD is on climate related, but what about the non-climate related? So this is where the exchange is very helpful, instructive, if I may say so. And the idea is to encourage listcos to look at the set of 27 metrics in addition to the sustainability framework of choice. So this would then give Singpos the opportunity to largely coincide the 27 metrics with our material assess factors. So in the course of doing the material assessment, we identified across a spectrum of activities, supply chain, manpower, including how we use our postmen on the roads in regardless of all sorts of traffic conditions, and then looking at these material factors and then aligning them with the 27 metrics that we are kind of obliged to report under. But just a quick point, Dan, if I may, I think it is hugely important to also look at it from another angle, which is that when we talk about how the board would set the tone at the top so that management can then continue to cascade down in terms of execution, I come back to the diversity in terms of sustainable and ESG knowledge and intellect. So the powerhouse of the board is that they are an agent of the shareholders. The management is an agent of the board. And there is a positive duty for the board to discharge its fiduciary duties, not just in terms of complying with the regulations of the company or the domicile in which the company is based, but also duties towards the climate. So in this regard, I would just say that I would like to round back my thoughts to the audience and to fellow panelists who have talked very strongly about diversity. It is definitely beyond gender. It is about the cross-diversified spectrum of experiences, of sectorial experiences, of the knowledge, of the various experiences in the subject director's career, all the storytelling that the director is able to do. And these storytellings and all the various hard work that a director and directors forming together will then avoid what we call a think tank, a group thing, and kind of all aligning to the same, but therefore the diversity comes across very powerful in the ESG framework and agenda.
So Linda, you raised this broader question of diversity, not just gender diversity, but diversity in all of its forms on the board, and that brings with it something very tangible and special to this broader ESG discussion. And in fact, we've got a question from the audience. It's directed at you, Sophie, believe it or not. And the question is essentially, does diversity on the board, does having a more diverse board help companies drive ESG and integrate ESG into its operations? Have you seen that? I mean, you serve on two public companies, private bank and a couple funds. Does that resonate with you? Is there a link there with diversity?
So experience-wise, yes. And statistically as well, yes. So I'll be coming out with a new report in the coming months. But 2 years ago, we did a survey at LeaderXXchange with Columbia University on a global investor director survey on climate risk management. And we specifically tracked age, gender, and geography and types of companies. And what came out, and I think supported by other research out there, and what came out when it came to climate risk was a real gap in gender at the board level. So women were more inclined to look at climate as a risk management issue than men. Women were more inclined, this is statistic, pure statistics, were more inclined than men to look at ESG as a strategic issue. And where that gap closes is generationally, because boards are generally a bit older. And so our survey was with both older and younger people, but on the investor side, we had a much broader spectrum, age spectrum, when it came to the survey. And we surveyed about 140 people. We have a new one coming out this year. So we'll see if that gap increases or decreases. My guess would be it decreases. But what we noticed on the investor side is also that gap, is that women in the investment community were much more inclined to look at ESG in their investment decision-making processes, much more inclined to look at it from a strategy in terms of disclosure and also strategy of the business. But as investors got younger, that gap narrowed. So that really reinforces the experience that I've seen. The other thing I think perhaps on the board side, and I think this is more historic, and it doesn't contradict at all Linda's point, is that to get women on boards, there was a broad outreach in terms of skill sets and experiences, because the traditional board director was a former CEO of a public company for these larger companies. And we all know that women CEOs were few and far between. So to get women on the board, they had to expand that diversity. So one can explain the other, is that the gender, and in some cases we have quotas, but the incentive to broaden the diversity on a gender spectrum, just with the factor of the gender, really forced companies to rethink their skill set matrix, to rethink the kind of people that would add value to the board, because you don't want to have people who don't add value. That's just not what you want. And so I think that all of that is happening. It's really a chicken and the egg, but all of that is happening together. So long story short, yes, I think it has an impact. But in the future, I think that gender diversity will have less of an impact as the generations and as the urgency of each ESG and its critical impact on strategy really come to light.
Thank you, Sophie. And Qais, maybe I can bring you in here based on everything that you see across the UAE, across the GCC and the broader region. Do you see a similar connection here between diversity on boards and better ESG performance, or just better performing boards? And is it all the same thing? I mean, Sophie's mentioning not just gender, but generational diversity, generational divide. Again, you mentioned earlier that you work with a lot of family controlled companies, where I imagine generational change happens, but might happen slowly, or is a real issue in the boardroom. Can you talk a little bit about that kind of diversity?
Yeah, sure. So what we're seeing in general is that organizations are more and more understanding that diversity helps them reduce the risk of the group thinking, as Linda has mentioned earlier. It also helps them in better understanding their company's customers. So when you have diversity on the board and even filtered all the way across the organization, you get to understand better your customers and be able to serve them better. We rely on a lot of that topic, and we're seeing that, for example, in the S&P 500, there's a lot of companies that are well diverse, whether it's on the board or across the organization, have witnessed a faster economic turnaround and a better management of the COVID situation from a business perspective, right? And then, so what we're starting to see is that there's a very strong correlation between diversity and business performance for organizations, right? And this is part of the awareness that we try to bring to our customers. On the local market level, diversity, we're seeing it primarily on gender, but we're also seeing some interest in some local companies wanting to go global, and as they do that, they need to understand global customers better, and this is where they start to look at diversity across gender, racial, skill set or experience in different regions, ethnic, and so forth. Yeah, I think those are some good examples on this domain. I'm also I wanted to put a comment on what we're seeing. Like if I speak to my U.S. colleagues or my European colleagues, the diversity topic is far more advanced. And so when you look at what is holding back some of the countries around the topic of diversity. And I think there's a number of different issues that we see in some parts of the region. One is education and some local culture that kind of still didn't mature enough to understanding the benefits of diversity. We're seeing that regulators are not really that active in this, or as active in this topic, and setting up the regulatory requirements to kind of herd the business community towards diversity. And we're seeing that some organizations are so we're seeing in some countries there is a different balance between local investors and global investors. So whenever you see countries that are attracting global investors, you will see a very much stronger maturity in the ESG topic because global investors pay close attention to this, and they put a lot of.
That's fascinating, and maybe Anthony, I could ask you nearly the same question. I mean, because you have this bird's eye view across lots and lots of different countries and geographies. Qais raised, as an explanation for some of this, that it could be differences in regulators' interest. It could be, shareholder, what the shareholder roles look like, local versus international. Do you have a sort of armchair explanation for why some places just seem to be a little bit further behind than others on this?
Well, if you're talking about the diversity issue, one thing, I mean, what we track at the UN level is gender equality on boardrooms. It's one of the universal things that we can track. Gender equality is one of the Sustainable Development Goals, and I should emphasize that it's a fundamental human right. So that's what we track. Of course, individual markets will have many other types of characteristics that that come into this diversity conversation. But even focusing on gender equality alone, many of the tools that one would deploy are also useful for increasing the diversity of boards more generally. I think it was, as it was stated earlier by Sophie, you start to get into fundamental questions about board selection, which I think are important. Earlier this year, we published a ranking of all of the stock exchanges in the G20 based on the gender balance of the boards of their top 100 issuers. And of course, you see a huge difference between the top of the list and the bottom of the list. And what's interesting for us is that in some markets, you do have mandatory minimums. In quite a few markets, in fact. The number one exchange on that list would be the Paris Exchange, where 44% of all board seats are held by women. But the mandatory minimum in that country is 40%. But what we found very interesting is the number 3 market on that list is the London Stock Exchange, which is about 32%, something like that, of board seats held by women. And there's no mandatory minimum at all. So that's just purely with voluntary initiatives, education, et cetera. They've managed to do a good job. I would also point out that there are some exchanges at the bottom of the list that have mandatory minimums. So again, it's not a magic wand. If your mandatory minimum is quite low to begin with, like many markets will say you must have at least 1 seat on the board must be for a woman. Okay, if your board averages 10 to 15 members, then you've just locked in a sub 10% representation. So I think there are different policy tools that can be deployed, whether they're mandatory minimums or whether they are more voluntary schemes and education programs and so on. And I think which ones you use in which market will depend on local circumstances.
Yes, and we've seen this argument before that a mandatory minimum or another word for it might be called a quota, could be a safe harbor as much as it can be anything else, or it could be an excuse or allow companies to hit a certain point and go no further. Sophie, I expect you've got views on this. France is famously, as Anthony said, is at the top of the list, nearly 45%. Yet we also see, that there are unintended consequences of things like this. In France, you talk about les jupes dorées, the golden skirts is the translation. That there are women who perhaps serve on many boards at the same time in order to fill the quota, which isn't quite what people had wanted, I think, or expected from it. You see also more than one country, not just Paris, not just France, but do you have views on what seems to work best?
Well, thank you for this. So I've been tracking gender diversity in leadership now statistically since 2014 using Visio Iris, which is a Moody's company data. And we came up with a methodology really to find if there was a correlation between gender diversity in the board, gender diversity in the C-suite or the senior leadership team, and then gender diversity in management, because that's really where the original pipeline for future leaders is found. And we did find where there were countries with quotas, there wasn't necessarily a follow through in management or the leadership team. That's what we found. So it really goes into what Anthony's point was that quotas doesn't necessarily, it triggers a change at the top level. It doesn't necessarily always generate the trickle down effect, because it's actually the other way around. It's trickling up. It needs to trickle up versus trickling down, especially at the board level. So to that point, I think that's important. However, in countries where had there been no quotas, and including the United States, if you look at California, had there been no quotas, obviously investors are pushing for a lot of pressure. In the UK, there was a lot of pressure and a lot of clubs and groups to get that pressure going. Had there been no pressure, nothing would have changed. And you would probably have under 10%. And beyond that, because I think what really is important, what's really important in that conversation that Anthony pointed out, is the gender diversity or gender equality topic is a topic that opens the door to everything. It really opens the door to composition in a much more holistic and much more meaningful way, company by company. It's not just about, it's really about who do you want on that board? And I think that's the conversation we're seeing. So to your point of golden skirts, that's actually an expression I had read for countries where there were no minimums or maximums boards that you could serve on. So certain men, because you had the golden pants and you had the golden skirts. So it's pretty much equality in that sense. So countries where you have no limits, you're going to see the same bad governance practices. But countries that have good governance practices, you're not going to see women with 20 seats and men with only 4. So I think it's really, it's putting it back into perspective. But I do think it's very meaningful. I think it's, and ultimately there will be no future need for quotas in some of those markets at the board level, though we're discussing and we're seeing quotas on C-suite and leadership team trends.
Yeah, that does seem to be what's coming next, is looking more closely at the composition of the executive team. I know certainly the Deloitte report that we put out every other year about women in the boardroom, which comes out later this year, is looking much more at at the pipeline and at CEO, CFOs, women chairs, for example. But Linda, can I bring you into this conversation too? I mean, you can certainly react to some of this this discussion about quotas. I don't think Singapore has I think it's a jurisdiction that does not have a mandatory minimum or a quota, but yet you do have very diverse boards in a lot of ways. Of course, in Singapore, it's not just about gender. You have a lot of different nationalities. It's a real melting pot in many ways. So you could react to that. But Linda, the other question I'd have for you is just about the board's role in all of this, because after all, the topic of our panel is the board and ESG. And I'm fascinated, given your role with the Singpost board, how does the board take responsibility for this question of what is increasingly called DE&I, diversity, equity, and inclusion? Are they making sure that not just that its own board, your own board is diverse, but are they working with management, setting expectations about what we want within all of the levels of the company with respect to diversity?
Yeah, great question, Dan. So first, I completely echo Sophie's views that she has so generously shared. Ultimately, a well-balanced and diverse board is a strength of governance. A well-diverse board with the well-diversified skills, competencies would give rise to a much better outcome in terms of decision-making. That aside, so in just on my board, I'm so proud to say that 50% of the board members are females. So you can see this is a very, very strong and truly well-diversified Singpost board. But beyond just the board composition, insofar as the C-suite as well as the senior levels of management, there is also adherence to the diversity policy, or we call it diversity. We do not call it a E&I as such, but there is a truly well-embedded diversity policy of the board, which then finds its way in terms of the principles into the employee code of conduct. So the code of conduct in some way embrace the employee, not just what the employee does in daily lives, coming to the office, not getting drunk at work and not committing fraud. Is beyond that. It is also about what females, in terms of equality, in terms of opportunities for intra-company transfers and all that are spelled out. So I would think that for Singapore companies, or Singapore societies by and large, we are very, very fortunate that the regulators, the systems and the establishments are all highly progressive in terms of embracing female diversity, female equality in management, and by management meaning senior management, as well as rank and file. And the tone at the top, therefore, is set very, very clearly. And I really think that this has brought about great works and great operations, great practices at the board level. And in that regard, I think that the board can then truly say that it can measure the quality and the outcome of its diversity policy. So I just pause here for a while.
Very good, and you should be congratulated, of course, and it's a fantastic achievement, with how diverse your board is today. Every board can always do better, and I guess if I could challenge you a little bit, what is the work that still remains to be done for you, with respect to this question? Do you feel like there's still work to go? Is there something that you would like still to see? Or
right. Just very quickly, I think that for my board being well diversified, tick. Females on the board, tick. Females on C-suite, tick. So what else, right? I would say this to my audience: there will be still never a day where you rest on your laurels. How we integrate ESG with strategy, how we build in and build out the capabilities across the board in moving and strategizing, putting the strategy into the board workings of ESG will be something that I would really look forward to work with the board.
So I'm just conscious of time. I think we've just got a few minutes left, perhaps just for one more question. We've covered a lot of ground, from climate and the environment, to social issues, to diversifying the board and how the board pushes this with management and oversees it. Perhaps if I could ask each of you to just think about everything we've covered. And I know we've got an audience that is likely composed of mainly executives and non-executives who are looking to do more. Perhaps they're in a company that has thought about this but hasn't quite grabbed a hold of it and moved things forward quite fast enough. If you could give one piece of advice to someone in the audience who would like to make a difference, as a non-exec or as an executive, to make a change, what one or two things would you recommend? And maybe looking to see, maybe Qais, you're smiling. Is there one thing that you've got in mind that you could give? Yeah.
Thank you for this. One of the things that I would advise on is try to elevate the discussion in your agenda, whether you are on the board or you are on the executive management. So if you have a meeting that has so many different topics, don't make it the least prioritized topic. Elevate that. And a nice way to do that is by tying the business impact to the topic. So, what is the financial benefit to the company? What is the impact on employee retention or that sort of thing? And that definitely brings the discussion to a whole different dimension, which ends up resulting in actionable insights that eventually the organization will do to make the change. So yeah, that's one.
So elevate it, connect it to bigger issues like strategy. Really good advice. Anthony, what about you? Is there a piece of advice you might offer?
Yes, I would just say that in the sustainability space, the ESG space, it's a very big umbrella. There are many different topics in there that people can be faced with. So it's very easy to have a sense of being overwhelmed. So my recommendation is always trying to focus on one or two key issues for your company and for your industry. And almost every industry has got its headline issue. If you're an oil and gas company, your issues are going to be very different from, say, an apparel company. So focus on your headline issues and start to come up with concrete strategies to deal with these.
Sound advice. Linda, what about you? I suspect you've been in this position in the past as an executive who wants to make a change. What would you recommend?
Yeah, I would say very briefly is that the passion, the strong belief that I have as an executive, and in terms of the sustainability belief, passion of sustainability coupled with a good understanding at the board level and the management level, and between the board and management be completely aligned in terms of the way we identify material sustainable issues and to work on enhanced disclosures would be my pipe dream. Thank you.
I hope not just a pipe dream. And Sophie, you have the last word.
Oh, goodness. Well, I'm hoping just one little thing, because I think everything's been said. Operationally and practically is understanding going inside out and outside in. So the first thing is go reach out to all your stakeholders, start understanding who your stakeholders are and determine what they think of you in terms of their priorities. Secondly, internally, go and reach out to all your company, your staff, everybody, to determine what their priorities are, and then start mapping it one against the other. And then thirdly, once you've done all of that, take the big ones, the SASBs and the GRIs, and start mapping it. That's when you're going to see if you have blind spots, and that's where you're going to see probably that you're going to go further than SASB and further than GRI. So from an operational standpoint, there's some clear methodologies. I'm happy to share some, because I have actually a roadmap that's coming out soon, but it's something that's practical. It's not something that's only aspirational, but if you do it right, you'll inspire your employees and you'll really get things moving.
I like that, a connection between getting started very practically structured that leads to inspiration down the road. You guys have certainly been inspirational to me. Thank you. I can only thank our incredible panel, Linda, Qais, Anthony, and Sophie, and also what a global panel. My goodness, Geneva, Singapore, New York, Dubai, and Paris, all on one screen. This is a global issue. This doesn't have borders, and it's going to get even more important over time. So I want to thank everyone for joining today, and it only leaves it to me to say thanks again, and I think pass it back to Ashraf, I think. Thank you, guys.